Welcome to the Human Origin Project, where we explore the science of you. To keep up to date, go to our iTunes channel and subscribe, and please leave a review if you enjoyed today's show. Hello and welcome to the show. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most fascinating archaeological sites on the planet, located in southeastern Turkey on the Syrian border. What's so fascinating about Göbekli Tepe is that it dates right to the period when humans were undergoing the agricultural revolution. It's located right in the Fertile Crescent, which is where we attribute modern civilization as rising out of. Göbekli Tepe is a huge site, 90 football fields in size, and only less than 10% of that has been uncovered. The mystery of Göbekli Tepe goes very, very deep, so this will be one of many episodes where we explore this. But today we're going to introduce it and discuss some of the implications and why Göbekli Tepe really is potentially history-changing. We hope you enjoy today's show. If you have any ideas or research areas you feel are important to this conversation, we want to hear them. There are going to be many more discussions on this topic. We hope you enjoy today's show on Göbekli Tepe.
Hey Steph, how are you, man?
Yeah, good. How are you doing?
I'm well. It's been a busy week, but I'm excited for today's show. This is it's a topic that really founded our first discussions in the Human Origin Project, didn't it? And it's fascinating. I mean, I've always been fascinated in the idea of the agricultural revolution and, the Fertile Crescent, where our modern civilization really came from. And, we're talking about a site where it all really began.
Yeah, it's like you hear about all these advances in culture and civilization, and you think they sort of just pop up here and there and gradually develop. And then, I guess it was the same for me. Discovering that there was a place where it could have potentially all happened at once is pretty mind-blowing, especially now that more information's coming out about the site and the region and, everything that went on back in ancient times.
Completely. And I think that's a really good kind of pretense to have your mindset in when thinking about this topic, is that we're talking about the earliest lineage and the earliest evidence of our current civilization and, in the terms of how we live today. And we don't really we just attribute that as happening as an accident. And what we're talking about today really shows that, maybe there's possibilities that it didn't, and, that there was stuff happening we certainly don't understand, but, that maybe shows that there were earlier lines of, ourselves that were doing something that we don't really know about yet.
And I think the importance of the site was highlighted, I think it was last year. The Göbekli Tepe and the surrounding area was made a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is pretty high praise for a site. And I think the more that I've been learning about it, the more researchers, books that I've been reading and articles that have been coming out, it sort of keeps pointing back to the first signs of evidence that they've seen for, the first signs of agriculture, the first signs of metalworking, the first signs of domesticating animals and grains are in that region of the world. It's all just the first of everything. It's just the starting point, almost.
And these are all principles and, understandings about a history that are well known, yet the discovery of Göbekli Tepe really, showed a whole new level of intricate detail as to what actually happened during that period. And whilst there's a lot we don't know, and something about, putting into perspective how long ago this was in comparison to other archaeological sites, really, it blows my mind really how ancient, the site is. And, it's great to see that it's been named a UNESCO World Heritage Site and that it's been acknowledged this way. But I really think the interpretation is something, which is what we'll talk about. But, let's go into, what Göbekli Tepe is. It's located on the border of the southeastern border of Turkey, on the border of the Syrian border. And it's right in that Fertile Crescent where we know modern civilization began. But it was first discovered in the 70s, wasn't it, by farmers, and what they noticed was these pot-belly hills, and they actually ran into large stones buried in the hills, and it ended up being studied by archaeologists at the time, who wrote it off as being a natural hill, didn't they?
Yeah, and I think there was even examples of farmers kind of turning up these strange sort of carved rocks in their plows and things like that, and archaeologists would come and look at them and just write them off as kind of Roman ruins, or more modern creations. And it wasn't until 1994, I think, that the first serious look at it from an archaeologist happened by a man by the name of Klaus Schmidt, who's part of the Heidelberg University in Germany. And the first time he saw the site, he realized, well, he just had a thought that he was going to spend the rest of his life there, because it was so profound to him.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Schmidt's commitment and story as well. And we'll come back to that a little bit, but thought I'd just kind of say, where the site is. So located close to the border, it's the southeastern Anatolia region of Turkey, which is 12 kilometres northeast of the city Sanliurfa. And actually, Göbekli Tepe actually means potbelly hill in English. And there's actually other kind of theories as to what, and ideas as to what the name means, and which is a long story. But it's interesting to there were those murmurings. It was the 60s that an archaeologist named Peter Benedict wrote it off as being a bunch of strange hills, but then took 30 years for Schmidt to come along, and he'd been working at a site called Navali Quarry, which was near. And so what he recognised is in all these little carvings and the style of stones that were being uncovered in the area were very similar to this Neolithic sites he was working on. And actually Navali Quarry was flooded by a dam, and so he was looking for another site in the area, and then this discovery came across, and as you said, he spent the rest of his life there.
Yeah, and it blows my mind thinking about how long he would have been digging around that area. I think they could only dig something like a third of the year or half of the year because it's so hot over there, and when they could dig, it was only for an hour or two a day, broken up into sections. And throughout his almost 20 years or 20 plus years of excavating the site, they only ended up uncovering maybe 10%, I think, or a bit under 10%, which is just mind-blowing to think of the scale of this site. That is the oldest evidence we have of any sort of megalithic stoneworking on the planet.
Yeah, I think they used to rise at like 3 or 4 a.m. in order to avoid the hot hours of the Turkish and Syrian environment, and then they would kind of take their findings for the day back to his house, where they would have breakfast and kind of uncover things in the coverage of his house. But 20 years, like, it really does, like, that really kind of always, I was always so appreciative of that. Like, someone that would devote so much time to painstakingly slow work such as archaeology, and a site that we don't really understand. Like, what do you think when you're taken to a site in 94 where we don't know really what, there's nothing really precedenting that he's going to find anything significant there and really commit to doing something like that. Like, obviously he felt there was something significant to this, and he said that he was drawn to it and he knew he'd spend the rest of his life there.
Yeah, I think it would have taken someone like Schmidt. I don't think anyone would have been so determined to stay and work out exactly what was going on. Yeah, I can't imagine. Like, you always read about these new discoveries and archaeological finds, but to actually imagine day by day them on their hands and knees kind of uncovering grain by grain, it's kind of like, it's hard to imagine. I can't imagine myself doing that.
The level of commitment is unbelievable, and archaeologists do it. Really, that's how they base their careers. Is quite remarkable. But Schmidt's work is particularly, I think, pivotal because of how important Göbekli Tepe is, and so it is this collection of T-shaped rocks, and this is what they found in this potbelly hill. But so what he found was that the hill was not a natural knoll. but it was actually a man-made series of hills that were built on top of each other. So there were these huge stone pillars that were arranged in circles with two central big T-shaped pillars up to 22 foot tall. The different enclosures had different sized pillars and different quality of work, but the size and complexity of the carvings is really quite breathtaking when you see the pictures. And so on the articles on the website we featured some of the pictures that really kind of represent how amazing this work was. And with, like you said, there's only less than 10% of it underground, so it's 12 times as big. Sorry, it's 12 football fields, and it's 50 times larger than Stonehenge, equaling 90,000 square meters. That is just mind-boggling.
And it's 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, which is, and when you think Stonehenge is old, and it's hard to imagine the context of that being built, but go back another 6,000 years on top of that, and that's Göbekli Tepe. And the strange thing about it is there are so many, each stone circle with these stone T-shaped pillars, they're almost identical. They've got slightly different sizings and alignments and artworks, but it's pretty much the same pattern repeated again and again and again over this huge area of land, which no one can explain, and no one, to my mind, has come up with a reason for why they would do this. It doesn't really make sense to me.
That's what's so intriguing about Göbekli Tepe, is that we really don't know what it represents and why it was put there. And when you put it in the context too, so these huge pillars, these come, like you say, 6,000 years, so that's longer from us to supposedly when Stonehenge was built. So between Stonehenge and Göbekli Tepe, there's a longer period of time, and I think that takes a lot of perspective to really appreciate how far in the past this is. And it really breaks our modern conception of potentially the idea of what hunter-gatherers were doing. And there is also the opening the door of the potential of maybe there were people in that time that weren't hunter-gatherers, and where did the ability to make these stones come from?
Yeah, and I think that thinking about that is even more strange when you kind of put it in the perspective of what was happening on Earth at that time. And I think we spoke about that in our last podcast, about the Younger Dryas period. And the earliest dating of Göbekli Tepe so far is to the period just after that Younger Dryas period ended. So there's all these kind of strange questions that keep popping up the more you go into learning about Göbekli Tepe. But one of the really strange things, well, the strangest thing in my mind is learning that the site itself was purposely buried after it was, about 1,000 years after it was finished being built. The entire 22 football fields or whatever it was buried, which is one of the only reasons why we still have access to it today, was because it was buried underground.
Well, it was buried in increments, wasn't it? So, and that's the amazing thing about, because that was such a discovery of Schmidt, and it must have absolutely been a watershed moment in his career when he did the carbon dating on the soil from surrounding the stone circles, and finding, because you can actually determine between soil that's been laid down by sediment and soil that has been purposely buried, so it will all date and it will have a certain type of
there's like
analysis.
There's like a uniformity to the soil. It's like there's no way it could have been done naturally, because it all dates to the same period and it's all the same type of soil, and it's all of the
so
same.
It wasn't
origin.
laid down by a period of time.
It wasn't.
It
wasn't sort of hundreds of years of rain and flooding and wind and that sort of thing building up the soil. It was all in one big heap, just dumped on it.
And so what they could do is they would actually date the more superficial, the stone circles that were higher up or more close to the surface, as being younger, And so the site looked like it was actually used over 1,500 years and buried in increments. So they would actually look like they were using a circle, they would create it and then they would bury it and then build another one on top or something like that, because it's this strange arrangement where they're built roughly around each other and on top of each other, and over 1,500 years or longer they created these hills. And it's just an utter mystery, like how did people in these times, one, have the knowledge, but then two, the purpose. Like, it's a very, very big undertaking, right? And one thing that really kind of stuck out for me is that you don't have the evidence of any civilization nearby, and so there's probably some explanations for that too, isn't there? Especially considering the age of the site and how little we know about this time. There's, for instance, we say that there is no evidence of workers, for instance, like near Stonehenge, for example, you have evidence of dwellings and the workers, and the pyramids, the Egyptian pyramids, are the same. But near this huge site, the biggest site on the planet, the oldest site, we don't have any evidence. And I wonder if that's because the evidence has disseminated over time, or whether maybe it was a gathering from surrounding communities.
Yeah, that's one of the strange things about the excavations so far and of the surrounding areas. There's been no pottery found. There's been no evidence of trash. If you have a culture living somewhere, you usually find things that they've left that have been buried with the objects that they've built. There's no burial sites, so it doesn't look like anyone was living there. And there are no tools. Before Göbekli Tepe existed, the oldest tools didn't even date back as far as Göbekli Tepe that could have built it. So you kind of wonder, how on earth did they build it without the tools necessary to do it? And also, it's not near a water source, so it's not near if you're trying to build the biggest megalithic site on earth, you probably need to be near running water, or at least a dam or something to sustain yourself, especially over that sort of undertaking. So when you put all these things together, it's really bizarre. It's really hard to imagine how it all came together.
I do wonder if that was different too, though, because, as you said, this does border on the end of the youngest dryas, and the Earth was a very different place, and just gone through this turbulent period of both mass sea level rises and so forth. So maybe there was water, but it doesn't. Conventionally, we can't find the normal signposts of civilization.
Yeah, and the hard thing trying to piece all this together, one of the hardest things is that it's so old that it's earlier than any evidence we have of writing or written language anywhere in the world. I think the earliest form of written language is something like 3000 BC or around that area, around that sort of time. But yeah, Göbekli Tepe predates that by 9,000 years or something along those lines. It's kind of bizarre. We're just saying these numbers. It's really hard to imagine what that means. But so the only thing really that's left to try and work it out, apart from the archaeological record, is myths and legends and stories and symbolism among surviving cultures, and language that cultures are still using today that could be tied back to periods in history that sort of span so long ago.
And when you get into archaeological records where there are no written language, it becomes very difficult. And of this age, this is why we know so little about it. It becomes a complete mystery, because we cannot. It's so far from things we can conventionally tie to historical civilizations that we know of, that the people that made Göbekli Tepe are a mystery. Even though they are. This is what really fascinates me, that these people are us. Whatever became our modern civilization, the people that made Göbekli Tepe are our own descendants, or what we would become descendants of. Yet we know so little about them. That's that's why I think about Göbekli Tepe on a daily basis. I think just because for me it anchors this last point of, reachable evidence of where we came from, in terms of solid modern humans. Yet it just goes into the darkness of complete and utter mystery.
It's such a strange thought, thinking that it could have been buried underground forever as well. Like, it was just by complete chance that Klaus Schmidt stumbled upon it. And I mean, even if it was anyone but Klaus Schmidt, I feel like they wouldn't have given it as much importance as he did, and as much time and as much research that went into it.
It could have easily been missed. And whilst it doesn't have written writing, it does have, like, a lot of the stone pillars have symbols on them, and so there's carvings of animals and certain shapes and representations of what, I guess you can call that language too, but it's not a written language as such. But there are many animals across the different enclosures that have been uncovered, which are very few. But it does seem to show that they were trying to represent something. They call this the oldest temple in the world. There was clearly a site of some kind of ritual or understanding, or some kind of bringing knowledge to the forefront and sharing it with people that we can't connect to. But the symbols do present an interesting kind of look into what was going on there, don't they?
They do, and that there's strange occurrences of these symbols popping up across different cultures across the world, and similar motifs and similar carvings and imagery. And to get an idea of some of the images that are seen at Göbekli Tepe, they're not regular carvings that are carved into stone. I mean, there are some that are carved into stone, but a lot of them are what's known as high relief carving, which is, instead of carving into the stone, you remove the outside of the stone and are left with an image. So at Göbekli Tepe, there's images of all kinds of animals, like foxes and birds, lions, snakes, scorpions, strange-looking boars that look sort of prehistoric, and they're everywhere. And there's a lot of, in almost every enclosure that they've found so far, there's been heavy amounts of vultures and birds of prey and things like that, things that have no explanation as of yet. If it was a place of people coming together and sharing information and learning and teaching, then what were they learning by looking at all these animals and these symbols? And they must have had some sort of importance to these cultures, because they've sort of been carried through to other parts of the world. And it's I have no idea what it all means.
It's so interesting, Luke, because as you say, you do see kind of echoes of the concepts used at Göbekli Tepe and the symbols and the animals. But going back to the technology required, so for high relief carving, if you look at the pictures if you Google Human Origin Project with Göbekli Tepe, you'll see the article, and there's a picture of it's like a lizard, isn't it? That's sitting, and so basically the lizard sitting, looking down vertically on the pillar, and that's called low relief stone carving, where they actually have to carve the details of the lizard so it actually sits on the surface of the pillar, this huge T-shaped stone pillar, and it's basically the hardest type of stone masonry you can do, because it's so difficult. The tools you have to get into for all the intricate details of the nails and the head, and it has to be carved on the outside of a flat pillar. And to me, that I can't see how they did this, with primitive tools. But yeah,
I think that's a really good point. It's not just that they made the oldest and the largest temple ever found. They also used some of the hardest techniques of stone masonry. And even the T-shaped pillars are huge. I think the biggest ones are 22 foot tall, which is
taller than a giraffe.
Yeah.
Well taller than a giraffe.
So, I mean, I've been to the zoo and I've seen a giraffe. I haven't been to Göbekli Tepe, but I can't even comprehend the size. And trying to not only stand those T-shaped pillars up, but make sure you didn't drop them and crack any of the carvings that you just cut into them. And I think all of the T-shaped pillars and most of the enclosures that they've found so far have been built upon flat bedrock. So
would they have had to place the bedrock? Does that what that means? I'm not sure.
I think they either found a very flat piece of earth or leveled it out themselves. I mean, if they're moving 20-ton blocks of stone and they're carving high relief animals and are capable of building and burying this site, I feel like they could potentially have had the capability of leveling out the ground and, you know, having a playing field that was good to go from the start.
I think Schmidt covers these kind of things because Schmidt wrote a lot of books on his work on Göbekli Tepe, and he talks about these kind of things that, and like, for instance, shaping bedrock, for instance, that's a quite very technical thing to do. It seems like a very strange occurrence for people that are supposedly coming out of being hunter-gatherers, and it just brings more to the mystery. We can't explain it. But overall, you know, these animals, you know, they do seem to echo throughout societies later on, don't they? And so, for instance, there's a lot of representations of the vulture. As you said, the fox is represented a lot. But then you do also see these symbols echoing throughout other cultures too. So from Göbekli Tepe, and you know, we know it's the center of the agricultural revolution where we began to farm. You can trace all the grains, you can trace all the many of the lineages of sheep, and goats, and that's really interesting. Actually, we're going to cover that at a later point. The agricultural revolution centered around Göbekli Tepe and the evidence of that, which is, you know, fascinating. Just paints a bigger picture of what's happening. But then the symbolism, because what we're stuck with, and this is where what the human origin is based on, is to follow the evidence of what we know about these occurrences, and really the symbols, and you know, how we can follow them through subsequent cultures and mythologies and teachings. You know, what can we trace back as being potentially connecting to get Göbekli Tepe? And they happen around the world, don't they?
Yeah, and I think it's hard to picture for our modern day cultures where we rely on written language and technological communications and things like that. But if we put ourselves in the mindset of these ancient cultures that used, for them, symbolism was one of the main ways of transmitting information. And that's something we don't really use so much, but it pops up again and again in ancient cultures. And there's these strange connections between old sites that tie back to Göbekli Tepe through these similar images and similar symbols. And I don't think we've mentioned, but on the T-shaped pillars, they've been carved with hands, sort of long arms on the side, running down the side of them with hands at the end, which is really similar to, I don't know if anyone has seen pictures of Easter Island, the Moai statues on Easter Island.
I think we featured there was some on our Instagram, where they dig under the platform of the Moai heads, and there's actually these hands. Yeah.
Because I mean, I always thought it was just heads, but I think they've excavated a lot of them, and they're huge standing figures with these stone heads, and along the side, almost identical to Göbekli Tepe, these huge statues have long arms with hands poking out the sides. And Easter Island was dates thousands of years later to Göbekli Tepe, yet the symbols are almost identical. And that's, not sure if anyone's come to the conclusions as to what that means for Göbekli Tepe, but it seems to be, you know, anthropomorphizing.
Anthropomorphic?
Yeah, it's a long word. Either remembering ancestors or celebrating people, or, you know, teachers or gods, or some sort of human figure was being depicted by these huge pillars. They weren't just standing stones like you see at Stonehenge or other stone circle sites around the world. They were purposely made to represent people.
Yeah, And there are similar sites too. There's some similar T-shaped symbolism happening. I think it's Malta and some Spanish. I think it might be. I can't remember the island now, but this ancient kind of symbolism does show up. But there certainly seems to be a representation. So you have these two bigger pillars in the middle, which are facing each other. So it seems like people facing each other, and there are also symbols based on that. Two heads or two curved lines or figures facing each other with a division in the middle, and they are all represented around this meeting of these two central points. So whether that's people or whether that's God, who knows? It's so hard to place. But as you say, there is this connection to Easter Island and also in Indonesia, actually, you see similar styles of carving. These figures with strange large heads, for instance, that are similar to the style, and there's also penises carved out and other strange things and some astronomical markings too.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about the astronomical stuff. I haven't seen too much of that, but I've definitely seen, as you said, strange depictions of erect penises on certain pillars, which is, I don't know if anyone's been to Egypt, but there's a lot of hieroglyphs of really similar depictions of these people or animals or anything with this, similar symbols of.
And same as that you find it in Indonesia, you also find it in Indigenous Australian society as well, where they have the phalanx symbol. So, I mean, obviously that's universal to humans, but there's also a similar style of drawing them as well too, isn't there?
Yeah, and not only those places, but also in the Native American tribes of North America, erect totem poles, and a lot of the imagery on these totem poles are very similar to the images depicted on these pillars in Göbekli Tepe, it's bizarre thinking that Native American cultures are still around today, and they could potentially be carrying the same memory or the same traditions that were either implemented or relearned or taught or whatever it was at Gobekli Tepe and carried through all of these years. It's hard to grasp that fact that these things can potentially survive if they have.
And there has been some scholars have written about how the T-shape might even be the earliest form of the cross. You find this in the Celts?
Yeah, the Celtic tribes and the ancient Irish cross. There's lots of old images of Irish crosses that look almost identical to the T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe, and then you see it in Egypt with the Ankh symbol, which is not quite the same, but it's a similar concept all the way up to pre-Christian and Christian idea of the cross. It's all over Neolithic UK, all through Ireland, Scotland, over to France, and Malta, like you said. It just sort of, whether that's just coincidence, but I mean, if you start bumping up against coincidence after coincidence, it starts making you sort of question if there's something more going on. I mean,
there's no doubt something of Göbekli Tepe resonated somewhere in the world. And one other thing is that there's like a handbag style symbol and numbers of them that resembles, you see things in, I think it's Peru, isn't it, South America, and at certain sites around there that have the exact same symbol. And you actually find that around the world too, don't you?
Yeah, I think I recently read a book about the New Zealand Maori, which are a tribe in New Zealand who, one of their myths, they talk about one of their ancestors going to this sacred site and returning with 3 handbags of knowledge, which if you see these images that go back to Tepe, they look just like handbags. They've got sort of a curved hemisphere top with a square bottom, and it could also represent a sort of early attempt of squaring the circle, or that ancient Egyptian concept of as above so below, trying to reconcile the heavens and the earth. And there's so many avenues you can go down with these images. It's really hard to to know where to stop.
It's interesting though that you do even find when you go back this far in history, the problem that we have now is that without written word, and actually just on that, like when you look at Egyptian hieroglyphs, which is considered a language, symbols could really be a written language that we don't understand too. So that's kind of maybe something that could be considered. So perhaps to them, these kind of carving could have been some kind of language. But when you kind of track back in the language of both the history of, for instance, ancient Egypt, they talk of times before, and they talk of their time being Zep Tepe, don't they? Which might relate to the idea of Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, it's funny when you don't have any written language to go off, it's sort of, you've only got spoken word and existing symbols and existing words that are still, were used by ancient cultures. But there's a strange connection. The Egyptians talk about the first time called Zep Tepe. It's like a quasi sort of mythical first time where they inherited all their knowledge and they were brought back to culture. And there's an interesting link with the word tepe, which I think in Turkish has upwards of 20 plus meanings. But it's in the area of in the part of the world that the Egyptians talk about. They were talking about this, and people were trying to surmise where it was, and then Göbekli Tepe was found, and it sort of put these sort of unsolved questions. It sort of opened up a lot of potential areas of research for answers for these seemingly mythical storylines that have potentially been opened up.
Yeah, like were the Egyptians talking about Gobekli Tepe when they said that? Maybe they were. It's completely reasonable for that to be actual, just speaking about the time when ancestors came together and put together this, because there's stonemasonry evidence which clearly went to these kind of knowledge were projected to Egypt at later times. So that's fascinating. But you also find it elsewhere too. It's in Buddhism as well, and that for instance, the use of the vulture. Yeah,
I think that in ancient Buddhism, it's said that that at a high mountaintop sanctuary that is known as Vulture Peak, that's where knowledge was first passed down to a Buddha, which is, we were talking before about birds of prey and vultures and the symbolism there. It is in the region of the world that Buddhism is thought to originate from, coming from the north through India down into China. It's a strange concept, thinking that these potentially, these really profound ancient ideologies and cultures could have stemmed from the same original source, which is something you don't really hear too much about, but it's really a fascinating possibility.
It's interesting too. You can also trace a little bit to there was a matriarchal cult back, like a religion back then, and they drew, and you find these in sites around Turkey. They carvings of very voluptuous women, and seem to worship the fertility of a curvaceous woman, and this seems to go through India. Is it the Shakti cult?
Yeah, the Shakti cult. They're still members of the Shakti cult I think it's in Orissa in India. But yeah, they're a matriarchal cult that focus on fertility and life, and they're very loving and very non-aggression. There's no fighting or warfare. But an interesting thing about they symbolize this woman that almost looks pregnant, which is very characteristic of Göbekli Tepe, which is known as a potbelly hill. And it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to picture a potbelly hill as the stomach of a pregnant woman. And I think another meaning of another description for Göbekli Tepe is a hill with a navel, which kind of ties it into that human theme. Yeah, there's a lot of layers to this symbolism, and you see the idea of the navel as somewhere where ideas and information and knowledge is born out of. not just in Göbekli Tepe, but across the world in places like Cusco in Peru. It's known as the navel. Uluru is thought of in Australia as the navel of Australian culture, at least in the Aboriginals' minds. There are sites all over the world where this navel symbolism is present, and that's tied directly into this Shakti cult who know that they're so old that no one knows exactly where they originated from, but it was somewhere to the north of India, which is towards Göbekli Tepe, which is it's a strange thought to have all these cultures stemming out of this region of the world where Göbekli Tepe pops up.
It's funny because we already know that that's where we come from. We call it the Fertile Crescent. We scientifically say this is where farming and the beginning of our civilization began. But these kind of connections, it's more detail, isn't it? And it just kind of paints a picture as to how potentially complex and powerful these, whatever the knowledge was being stored at Göbekli Tepe, because it was being stored too, wasn't it? They buried it to make sure it wasn't either destroyed or stolen or...
Yeah, it makes sense. If it was a site where the first knowledge was taught and, really profound information was shared, that you would want to preserve it. You wouldn't want it to be lost to time, to be slowly eroded away. And the ancient culture who built it or who lived there or whatever they were doing, they would have had to have a good reason to bury it. It would have taken, I don't know, thousands and thousands of people, months and months to bury that. Imagine trying to bury Stonehenge right now, and this site is 50 times bigger than Stonehenge.
They went to a massive trouble to bury it correctly and to bury it in a certain way and perfectly as well, because we're literally unearthing it nearly 12,000 years later in 1994. It's crazy to think of. It sounds like a movie, doesn't it? But this actually happened. And one thing you mentioned before too is that we find these echoes all around the planet, but there's a very, very interesting link, between one of the symbols on one of the pillars to, and you find it in Indigenous Australians. They actually use, it's very well, often used in their language, and it's nearly identical. And when you start drawing these language links, and these are the really, really interesting lines of evidence of where we came from, I think.
Yeah, and I still can't really wrap my head around how that even works, how something so old can still, there's still echoes of it today. And, there's potentially people out there who know and understand what these symbols mean. I guess we'll find out.
We're definitely going to find out. We're going to be, Göbekli Tepe is going to be the centre of, many articles for the Human Origin Project. We're going to have many people and researchers presenting their findings and their theories on it too. So, the article up on the website now is, the baseline knowledge, and that's really what this show is about. We're going to have more discussions on this. We're going to interview people, and potentially too, we're looking at getting a group to go to Göbekli Tepe. That's one thing I definitely want to do. Is I want to go to the site, have to go to the site, and so that's another thing to live and experience it as well.
Yeah, I can't wait to go. I think it will be. The pictures you see, the pillars are 4 times as big as the people that are looking at them. I can't imagine the power that it must give to you. And also just thinking back to the cradle of civilization and the agricultural revolution. In my head, it's farmers slowly learning how to farm and slowly teaching that and slowly spreading across the land. But having a site of this complexity that potentially was the place for that to happen, having a physical place, it's insane. It's like it's so. You look at these other ancient sites in the world with cultures that were already set up and they knew how to build and they knew what to do, but not knowing how these people at Göbekli Tepe went about what they did, it's really mind-boggling. Completely mind-boggling, and the mind-boggling problem that we're going to follow a lot and cover more. So I'm really looking forward to that. For those that want to read more about Göbekli Tepe, you can go onto the website and look at the article on the oldest temple
in the world. Also, there's a YouTube video that summarizes, some of the dimensions and details of the size. So check that out. And if you have any thoughts or areas of research you'd like us to cover, please leave them in the comments of this show, and please jump on the social channels and talk about this, because I really I go to places where people are talking about supposedly important concepts, and I think everyone should be talking about Göbekli Tepe nearly all the time, because it's only 10% of it is uncovered, and to me it's just like I want to know what's there. So yeah, I'm sure there are other people out there like that too.
Yeah, and it's great having having this platform to bounce ideas off and get as many different perspectives on it as we can to try and piece it together, because it's not just a individual archaeological site. It's the birthplace of potentially many other ancient sites and ancient cultures, and it's really exciting to get lots of opinions, get lots of ideas, and lots of avenues of research to try and piece it all back together. It's really exciting to be part of.
Completely is. I'm really looking forward to it. All right, I think we covered. You can only really scrape the surface. But I think we're going to have to bury what we've just done and leave it for next time. So I think next week we're going to talk about next week.
I think maybe you can talk about Stonehenge. Yeah,
that seems fitting. Yeah, we're going to jump through these different topics that are kind of well known, and we're going to go deeper and deeper into the lesser known too. There's lots and lots of research to come, and lots of interesting topics. All right, Steph, we'll see you next week.
Yeah, see you, Steve. Have a good week.
Thank you for listening to today's show. For more information, you can read the full transcript, articles, and discussion on our website, humanoriginproject.com. You can visit us on social media at Human Origin Project on Facebook and The Human Origin Project on Instagram. Follow us on Twitter or join the forum boards and email list to keep up to date with all the new information. And if you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review, because it helps others to find this information and helps us to bring you the topics you want to discuss and hear about. Until next week, I hope your life is filled with happiness, healthiness, and harmony.